The first snow hit Bitterroot Valley on September 17, 1874, and Lars Thoresen was standing in a hole. Not just any hole, a cavity 8 feet deep, 14 feet square, carved into the mountainside beneath where his cabin floor would sit. His neighbors figured he'd lost his mind somewhere between Norway and Montana territory. Thomas Bridger, who'd trapped beaver in these mountains for 23 years before his knees gave out, stood at the rim watching Lars set stone supports into the excavated earth. "You're building a root cellar under living quarters," Bridger said, shaking his head. "Moisture'll rot your floorboards inside 2 winters." Lars didn't look up from his work, just kept fitting stones with the precision of a man who'd learned something the hard way. "Not storing potatoes," he said. The statement hung there in the thin mountain air while Bridger tried to work out what else a man would bury under his home. When understanding finally arrived, the old trapper actually laughed. "Firewood? Underground?" He walked away still chuckling, and within an hour, half the settlement of 47 souls knew that the Norwegian had dug himself a wood cellar. The thing about frontier settlements in 1874 Montana, they ran on 2 currencies. One was actual silver, hard to come by and harder to keep. The other was dry firewood, and in a place where winter temperatures dropped to 42 degrees below zero, a man with seasoned wood was richer than most bankers. Traditional wisdom said you cut your wood in spring, stacked it in open-sided sheds where summer wind could work through it, and hoped 18 months of weathering would drive enough moisture out to make it burn hot instead of smoking like wet leaves. Lars Thoresen was proposing to season firewood in 6 months, in the dark, underground. The settlement's response ranged from skeptical to certain he'd end up burning green wood and choking on creosote by January. Catherine Walsh, whose husband had frozen to death 3 winters back when their cabin fire went out during a blizzard, had stronger opinions than most about firewood. She'd raised 2 sons alone since then, operating a small sawmill her late husband had built before his death. "I've been cutting timber in these mountains for 4 years, she told Lars when he came to buy lumber for his cabin frame. "Wood needs air and sun to season proper. Your pit'll trap moisture like a spring house." She wasn't being unkind. Catherine didn't waste energy on cruelty. She was stating facts as she understood them, facts purchased with her husband's life. Lars paid for his lumber in silver coins and said only, "We'll see come winter." It wasn't arrogance in his voice, just the quiet certainty of a man who'd tested an idea in his mind 1,000 times before putting spade to earth. The underground chamber took shape through June and July. Lars lined the walls with local stone, leaving deliberate gaps between rocks on the north-facing side. He installed 4 ventilation pipes made from hollowed pine logs, each 6 inches across, angled up through the mountainside to emerge 30 feet away, where prevailing winds would create draw. The ceiling he reinforced with timber beams strong enough to support not just his cabin floor, but the weight of a horse if one decided to stand there. Then came the detail that made Samuel Garrett, a carpenter who'd learned his trade in Vermont mills, actually climb down into the pit to examine it. Lars had created a secondary floor 4 feet below the cabin's actual floor joists, a suspended platform of split pine with 2-inch gaps between every board. "What's that for?" Garrett asked, running his hand along the timber. "Cold air falls," Lars said. "Hot air rises, wood in the middle." It was the simplest explanation of convection Garrett had ever heard, and it took him 3 minutes of standing there in the cool underground space before he understood what the Norwegian had designed. By August, Lars had his cabin standing, a modest structure, 16 by 20 feet, with a proper stone fireplace and 2 glass windows he'd hauled from Fort Benton. The cabin's floor sat on joists that doubled as the ceiling of the wood chamber below. Access was through a trapdoor in the cabin's corner, hidden under what would eventually be his bed. You wouldn't know the storage existed unless someone told you, which was probably smart given how folks felt about the whole enterprise. Heinrich Müller, a German farmer who'd successfully grown wheat where everyone said the altitude was too high, stopped by to see the finished work. "Underground storage makes sense for grain," he admitted, examining the cabin's construction. "Stays cool, keeps moisture stable, but firewood's different. Wood needs to breathe." He wasn't wrong exactly. He just wasn't considering all the variables. Lars had grown up in a valley where winter darkness lasted 20 hours a day, and temperatures lived below freezing from November through March. Norwegians had been solving cold weather problems for 1,000 years, and some of that knowledge had crossed the Atlantic in Lars's head. The real test began in mid-August when Lars started filling his underground chamber. He'd bought standing dead timber from Catherine Walsh, pine killed by beetles 2 years prior, already partially dried on the stump. He felled 14 trees, each between 60 and 80 feet tall, bucked them into 16-inch lengths, and split them into pieces roughly 4 inches across. Standard firewood preparation, nothing revolutionary. The difference was where he put them. Instead of stacking them in an open shed where Montana's high-altitude sun and constant wind would season them over 18 months, Lars hauled every piece down through his cabin's trapdoor and arranged them on the suspended floor of his underground chamber. He left 2-inch spaces between each piece, creating airways that ran in cross-hatched patterns throughout the stack. The vertical ventilation pipes created what Lars called breathing, cool outside air drawn in through the stone gap intake on the north side, warmed slightly as it passed through the wood stack, then pulled upward through the hollow log chimneys by natural convection. No moving parts, no maintenance, just physics and the Earth's constant 52-degree temperature at 8 feet down. By September, word had spread beyond Bitterroot Valley. A traveling minister named Joshua Whitfield, who rode a circuit covering 200 miles of Montana territory, stopped at Lars's cabin specifically to see the underground wood storage. Whitfield had been educated at a seminary in Boston before answering what he called the frontier's need, and he brought a seminary student's love of categorizing natural phenomena. "Interesting experiment," he said, watching Lars check the moisture level of his stored wood by weighing a piece on a balance scale he'd improvised from a plank and 2 water buckets. "What's your theoretical basis?" Lars held up the piece of pine. 6 weeks underground, and it weighed 2 pounds, 3 ounces. The same piece had weighed 3 pounds, 1 ounce when he'd first cut it. "Wood's 40% lighter," he said. "Water's leaving." Whitfield wanted to know how, given the absence of sun and wind. Lars walked him through the system, the constant temperature preventing condensation, the ventilation creating continuous air exchange, the suspended floor ensuring no ground contact. "Plus," Lars added, "it's dark. No sun means no photodegradation, no checking of the wood surface." Whitfield made notes in a leather journal, though he admitted later he wasn't sure whether he was documenting genius or watching a Norwegian freeze to death with scientific precision. The settlement watched Lars's project with the kind of attention people pay to things that might kill someone. By October, when normal woodcutting season ended and everyone else's sheds were filled with green wood that wouldn't be burnable until next spring, Lars's underground chamber held 4 cords of timber that he claimed was ready to burn. Thomas Bridger, who'd been skeptical from the start, brought a moisture meter, a simple device that measured humidity in wood by driving 2 nails into a piece and checking electrical resistance. He tested Lars's underground pine. 18% moisture content. For context, fresh-cut wood runs 45 to 60%. Wood burned efficiently at 20% or below. Bridger tested 3 more pieces. 19%, 17%, 18%. He looked at Lars with something between confusion and respect. "That's 6-month-old wood burning like it's been dried 18 months, he said. "How?" Lars just smiled that small Norwegian smile and said, "Earth stays 52 degrees. Air keeps moving. Water has to go somewhere. Now here's something most folks don't realize about frontier life. Information traveled faster than you'd think. By November, when the first serious snow locked Bitterroot Valley into winter mode, people were riding in from settlements 30 and 40 miles away to see Lars's underground woodshed. Not because they were believers, most still figured there was a trick or a lie somewhere, but because a technique that could cut firewood seasoning time in half was worth the 2-day ride if it turned out to be real. Catherine Walsh, whose initial skepticism had been absolute, brought her teenage sons to examine the system. She'd spent 4 years cutting and selling timber, and if there was a faster way to bring product to market, she needed to know. Lars showed her everything: the ventilation design, the suspended floor, the stone walls that prevented ground moisture from entering the system. "It's the opposite of what makes sense," she said, standing in the underground chamber with a lantern lighting the stacked wood around her. "But the wood's dry. I can't argue with dry wood. She bought lunch for Lars and his wife Ingrid that day, and by spring, she'd be digging her own underground seasoning chamber behind her sawmill. If you're finding value in learning about these forgotten frontier techniques, consider subscribing to help preserve this knowledge. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're practical solutions developed by people whose survival depended on getting things right. Every subscription helps document traditional wisdom that's disappearing from living memory. There's a link below, and folks who value self-reliance and tested techniques tend to find this channel useful. The real test came in December. Montana winter isn't theoretical. It's a physical force that finds every weakness in a man's preparation and exploits it like water finding cracks. December 19th, 1874, the temperature dropped to 38 below zero, and a wind came down from Canada that made the cold feel like knives. Lars burned his underground seasoned wood for the first time that night, and Thomas Bridger, whose cabin was close enough to share a property line, smelled the difference. Properly seasoned wood burns hot and clean, producing minimal smoke because there's no water left to steam away. Green wood smokes like a signal fire, wasting heat energy on evaporation instead of warming your home. Lars's cabin exhaled thin, almost invisible smoke that night, while every other structure in the settlement produced thick gray columns that hung in the frozen air like accusations. Bridger walked over the next morning, knocked on Lars's door, and asked directly, "How warm did you keep it last night?" Lars checked his thermometer, a mercury tube he'd bought in Fort Benton for $2. 68 degrees inside, he said. Burned 5 pieces of wood. Bridger's cabin, using wood he'd cut and stacked 18 months prior according to traditional methods, had struggled to reach 55 degrees while consuming 8 pieces. The mathematics weren't complicated. By January, Samuel Garrett had started excavating his own underground wood chamber. He modified Lars's design slightly. Vermont training made him skeptical of unsupported earth walls, so he built a complete stone room with a proper arched ceiling, which added 3 weeks of labor but gave him peace of mind. Heinrich Müller, the German farmer, took a different approach. He dug into a hillside rather than going straight down, creating a horizontal tunnel that could be accessed without climbing through a trapdoor. Same principles, different execution, which was exactly how frontier innovation worked. You took a proven concept and adapted it to your specific circumstances, skills, and materials. By February, 7 families in Bitterroot Valley were planning underground wood storage, and Catherine Walsh was telling everyone who'd listen that she should have trusted the Norwegian from the start. "Man who survives that far north learns things about cold," she said. "Should have known he wasn't guessing." The physics behind Lars's system weren't complicated, but they were counterintuitive enough that most folks missed them until someone explained carefully. Wood seasoning is just water evaporation. You're trying to reduce moisture content from 45% down to 20% or below. Traditional open-air seasoning relies on sun and wind to accomplish this, which works, but takes time. Lars's underground method attacked the problem differently. The Earth's constant 52-degree temperature created a stable environment where moisture couldn't condense back into the wood. The ventilation system, driven by natural convection and prevailing winds, provided continuous air exchange without exposing wood to rain, snow, or humidity fluctuations. The darkness prevented UV damage that could check and split wood surfaces, actually creating pathways for moisture re-entry during wet weather. Most surprisingly, the slightly elevated temperature underground, warmer than winter air, cooler than summer air, created ideal conditions for steady moisture migration from the wood's interior to its surface, where the moving air carried it away. The suspended floor ensured no capillary action could draw ground moisture upward. Every element worked together, and the result was wood that seasoned in 6 to 7 months instead of 12 to 18. Ancient Koreans had used similar principles in their seok bingo, underground ice storage chambers that kept winter ice frozen through summer by using constant earth temperature and strategic ventilation. The Romans had built underground granaries that kept grain dry and cool for years, using natural airflow and stable temperature. Lars hadn't invented anything new. He just recognized that principles of underground storage could be adapted to firewood seasoning, something nobody in Montana Territory had considered because the traditional method worked well enough. But well enough and optimal are different standards, And when you're living at 6,200 feet elevation where winter means 7 months of potential death from cold, optimization matters. February brought crisis. A Chinook wind, a warm air mass that periodically flows over the Rockies from the Pacific, hit the valley with unseasonable warmth. Temperatures jumped from 12 below zero to 47 above in 36 hours. Snow melted, rivers swelled, and then, as fast as it had come, the warm air passed and winter returned with what the Blackfeet called the moon of cold explosion. Temperature dropped 92 degrees in 4 days. By February 21st, thermometers showed 44 below zero, and wood that had been wet from melting snow and rain was now frozen solid and effectively unburnable without completely drying. Every shed in Bitterroot Valley held firewood that had been soaked by the Chinook's rain and was now encased in ice, except the underground chambers. Lars's wood, protected from weather, remained at its steady 18% moisture content. Catherine Walsh's new underground storage, which she'd completed in late January, held 3 cords of wood that had seasoned for just 94 days and was now the only dry fuel she had access to. Samuel Garrett's stone chamber, still under construction, couldn't help him. His traditional wood supply was frozen useless. The settlement faced a genuine survival problem. 14 families with young children, 3 with elderly members too frail to tolerate sustained cold, and everyone's primary fuel supply compromised. You could burn frozen wood technically, but it took 3 times as long to catch fire and produced minimal heat while the ice sublimated away. In minus 40-degree weather, that delay could mean frozen pipes, which meant no water, which meant a cascade of problems that could kill. Thomas Bridger called a community meeting in the small church building, the only structure large enough to hold everyone. The discussion was tense. Some families had enough seasoned wood from previous years to weather the crisis, others didn't. Distribution of resources became complicated by questions of who'd prepared adequately versus who'd gambled on an early spring. Into this argument, Lars made a simple offer. My chamber holds 4 cords. Community's welcome to it. The room went quiet. 4 cords would keep 2 families warm for the rest of winter, or 8 families warm for 2 weeks while their frozen wood dried. Lars wasn't proposing to solve everyone's problem. That wasn't possible. He was buying the community time. The decision was made to distribute Lars's wood to the families with the youngest children and oldest adults, 5 families total, given enough fuel to survive 2 weeks while their weather-soaked wood dried indoors. Heinrich Muller organized a rotation where men from households with adequate wood helped those without, by hauling frozen timber into their cabins to thaw and dry near stoves, accelerating the process. Catherine Walsh opened her partially filled underground chamber to 3 families who'd helped her dig it, proving that the system wasn't just Lars's secret, but a technique the community could adopt and share. Over the next week, Bitterroot Valley's 47 residents functioned as a collective organism, moving wood, sharing heat, rotating children between warm houses to prevent cold exposure. Not a single life was lost. Samuel Garrett's 6-year-old daughter, who'd been coughing for 3 days in a cabin that couldn't stay above 40 degrees, slept in Lars and Ingrid's home for 8 nights while her father dried his family's wood supply. She recovered fully. By March, when the crisis had passed and normal winter had returned, the settlement's perspective had fundamentally shifted. Folks weren't just interested in Lars's underground wood chamber anymore. They were committed to building their own. The technique had proven itself under the exact conditions that mattered: genuine emergency, lives at stake, traditional methods failing. Thomas Bridger, who'd laughed at the idea 9 months earlier, started excavating his own chamber in April. He was 73 years old and his knees complained about the ladder climbing, but he dug anyway, cursing his younger self for dismissing the Norwegian's innovation. "Pride's expensive," he told anyone who'd listen. "Costs you twice. Once when you're wrong, again when you're apologizing." He built his underground chamber with a gentler access ramp instead of a vertical trapdoor, adapting the design to his physical limitations. It worked perfectly. The minister Joshua Whitfield, who documented Lars's system in his journal the previous September, began including the underground wood chamber in his circuit preaching. Not as a religious metaphor, Whitfield was smarter than that, but as a practical survival technique that settlements should consider. He'd sketch the design on church walls with charcoal, explain the principles of thermal mass and convection, answer questions about ventilation placement and stone wall construction. By summer of 1875, 11 settlements across 200 miles of Montana territory had at least one underground wood chamber in operation. By 1877, the technique had spread to Wyoming and Idaho territories. A federal surveyor named Robert Hammond documented Norwegian-style wood crypts in his official report on frontier settlement patterns, noting that communities employing the method showed markedly reduced firewood consumption and improved winter survival rates. The terminology was wrong. They weren't crypts, they were climate-controlled storage chambers, but the observation was accurate. Here's what modern research tells us about Lars's innovation. Wood seasoning is governed by equilibrium moisture content, the point where wood stops exchanging water with its environment. In open air, this equilibrium shifts constantly with humidity and temperature changes. Underground, in a stable 52-degree environment with controlled airflow, equilibrium reaches an ideal level and stays there. Recent studies of underground aging in wine cellars, which use the same principles Lars discovered, show that stable temperature and humidity create predictable, accelerated maturation compared to variable conditions. Lars wasn't working from scientific papers. Those didn't exist yet, not about this application. He was working from empirical observation and inherited knowledge, but his conclusions matched what physics would later confirm. The underground chamber wasn't magic. It was applied thermodynamics, executed with hand tools and stone. Catherine Walsh's sawmill business transformed after she adopted underground seasoning. Previously, she'd cut timber and waited 18 months before selling it as firewood, which meant capital locked up for a year and a half. With underground storage, she could sell wood 6 months after cutting, tripling her inventory turnover. By 1876, she'd built 3 underground chambers behind her mill, each holding 6 cords, cycling wood through on a rotating basis. She employed 4 men year-round, significant for a frontier settlement, and her operation provided seasoned firewood to settlements 40 miles away. She never remarried, raised both sons to adulthood, and when she died in 1903 at age 68, she owned 2,400 acres of timberland and employed 17 workers. Her original underground chamber, expanded twice, was still in operation when her grandson converted the property to a commercial lumber operation in 1924. Samuel Garrett took Lars's basic design and refined it into a system that would have impressed Boston engineers. His stone-arched chamber included a hand-cranked elevator system for moving wood up and down, eliminating the ladder climbing that troubled older settlers. He added a secondary ventilation system with adjustable baffles that let him control airflow based on outside wind conditions. Garrett's chamber cost 3 times as much to build as Lars's original, 40 days of labor versus 12, but it could hold 8 cords instead of 4 and required no modification for 50 years of operation. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Garrett was commissioned to design underground storage facilities for the new territorial prison, adapting his firewood principles to food preservation. The prison's root cellar, based on Garrett's convection cooling design, maintained 38-degree temperatures year-round without ice, keeping food fresh for 600 inmates through summer heat. Thomas Bridger lived to age 79, which was remarkable for a man who'd spent 23 years in the mountains when mountain men had an average life expectancy of 47. He attributed his survival to learning from folks smarter than me, even when they're 30 years younger. His underground wood chamber, built when he was 73, served him until his death 6 years later, and his daughter continued using it for another decade. When she finally sold the property in 1895, the new owners, a family named Jacobson from Sweden, recognized the chamber's design immediately. "We call this a vedkjellar back home," they said. "Wood cellar. Smart building it here." They'd had the same idea in Sweden, independently arriving at the same solution to the same problem. Different continents, same physics, identical results. Heinrich Muller's horizontal tunnel design became the standard for hillside construction across Montana territory. By accessing the chamber from the side rather than climbing down through a trapdoor, Settlers could use wheelbarrows and carts for wood storage, dramatically reducing labor. Muller's original tunnel, dug into a south-facing slope behind his homestead, measured 62 feet long and could hold 12 cords of wood on both sides of a central walkway. He charged neighbors 50 cents to store a cord of wood in his tunnel, creating passive income from empty space. By 1883, he'd built 2 more tunnels and was earning more from wood storage than from wheat farming. He eventually built a small hotel near his property, catering to travelers who wanted to see the underground wood tunnels of Montana, which made him a minor tourist attraction in an era when frontier tourism meant looking at things that kept people alive. The technique Lars brought from Norway, refined, adapted, and shared across Montana territory, represented something larger than firewood storage. It was a demonstration of how frontier survival depended on intellectual flexibility, the willingness to question traditional methods, and the courage to test new ideas when the stakes were life and death. The settlers who mocked Lars's underground chamber in June learned by February that frontier orthodoxy wasn't wisdom, just habit. The ones who adapted survived better. The ones who remained rigid found themselves hauling frozen wood in -40-degree weather, while wondering why they'd trusted tradition over empirical results. Lars never said, "I told you so." He just dug his hole, built his system, and shared the results with anyone willing to look. That humility, combined with that quiet competence, was its own form of frontier leadership. By 1880, underground wood storage had become common enough in Montana territory that federal surveyors included it in their settlement reports as a regional characteristic. An 1882 publication by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, documenting indigenous and immigrant agricultural techniques in Western territories, featured a full-page illustration of underground seasoning chambers with detailed specifications. The technique had gone from one Norwegian's experiment to documented federal practice in 8 years, which was remarkable speed for an era without telephones or mass media. Information spread through demonstration, word of mouth, and the most persuasive argument possible. It worked. You could debate the theory, question the physics, or dismiss the whole thing as nonsense. But when Lars's wood burned hot and clean while everyone else's smoked, debate ended. Results settled arguments that words couldn't. Lars and Ingrid Thorsen raised 4 children in their cabin with the underground chamber, and all 4 survived to adulthood, a survival rate that was uncommon in 1870s Montana, where childhood mortality exceeded 40%. Their property eventually grew to 160 acres, proving up under the Homestead Act in 1879. They never got rich, but they never froze, and in frontier Montana, that was its own kind of wealth. Lars died in 1907 at age 71, outliving most of his generation. His obituary in the Bitterroot Valley newspaper mentioned his underground wood chamber specifically, calling it an innovation that saved lives and improved countless families' winter comfort. By then, the technique was so common that younger settlers didn't realize it had ever been controversial. They built underground chambers the way their fathers had, assuming it was traditional knowledge, not recognizing that tradition had started just 33 years earlier, with one Norwegian digging a hole beneath his cabin. If you've stuck with this story to the end, you're part of a community that values practical knowledge and frontier wisdom. Consider subscribing to help preserve these techniques for future generations. This isn't just history, it's a record of problem solving under genuine hardship, solutions developed by real people who couldn't afford to be wrong. Every subscription helps document knowledge that deserves to survive. The links below, and folks who value self-reliance tend to find this content meaningful. The underground wood chamber, that innovation everyone thought was crazy, represents something essential about human adaptation. We solve problems by questioning assumptions, testing ideas, and accepting results, even when they contradict conventional wisdom. Lars didn't reinvent physics. He just paid attention to how the world actually worked, rather than how people said it should work. He noticed that Earth maintains constant temperature, that air moves predictably, that moisture follows rules. He built a system based on observation rather than tradition, tested it rigorously, and shared it freely when it worked. That pattern, observe, test, share, built the frontier. It built America. It's still building things today, Wherever people face genuine problems with life or death stakes and limited resources, the tools change. The landscape evolves. But the fundamental human capacity to see a problem, imagine a solution, and implement it despite skepticism, that's constant. That's the real inheritance of the frontier. Not the specific techniques, but the mindset that creates them. Lars Thorson's underground chamber seasoned firewood in half the time, not through magic, but through attention, adaptation, and the courage to dig a hole when everyone else was watching.